Author Camilla Gibb found herself a single mother reeling after the breakup of her relationship. But there was a group of people who were there to help her, support her, and love her and her daughter. A group that became her new unexpected family, and she lays out its creation in her memoir. It's called This Is Happy, and with that we welcome Camilla Gibb. Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, so you're a novelist by trade. So at this point in your life, why a memoir?
I guess a couple of reasons. In advance of my last novel coming out, I had done nothing but read Canadian memoir. I was editing an anthology for Penguin. And so for 4 years, it's all I did was read memoir. And I found myself in conversation with many of these well-known authors about their lives, and I guess about my own. And there was this juncture in my life where I found myself unexpectedly pregnant on my own. And I found myself impatient with fiction. I actually found myself impatient with words. I felt like my relationship to language had changed. Maybe it was that I couldn't find the words to articulate my own experience. And I remember, it's a very specific impulse. I remember having just read Ian Brown's The Boy in the Moon. And I wrote to Ian, who was an acquaintance, and I referred to a specific line in his book where he talks about there being a ray of light in a very dark moment. And I wanted to know how you found that.
You were on the search for it.
Yes. And he said, you just have to write. You just have to write. And so that is where it really began, literally. There's a baby on one side and a notebook on the other, and I just began to write. And all I had to write was, it was an attempt to articulate what it was I was experiencing in that moment. So it's a memoir that's actually written, parts of it are written very much in the moment of living them, which is a strange, normally we write memoir in retrospect.
Right.
And so the early half of the book, of course, is the childhood. How do I come into this adulthood life that I'm living? But there's a sense of being inside and outside of my own experience at the same time.
And what's that moment for you? You said you were chasing the light, so I was trying to find it. You're inspired by what Ian said. Is there a specific incident where it's like, yes, I found it?
I think what I found interesting about the way Ian described that ray of light was he recognizes that in his situation, they have a severely disabled son. There are two parents who don't have 2 nights of sleep in a row for 8 years. And there was something about the inevitability of it, or the lack of choice, that he was reconciling himself to, which was, it's like, I have no agency in this situation, I just have to do what's required of me. And I understood that somehow. I didn't yet see the ray of hope, but I thought, I have to do what's required of me. I have to be a mother to this child. And then it was really only in standing back that I began to see around that work and joy who had assembled. And I started to look out and realize I'm forming relationships with people that never would have happened otherwise. With a nanny who comes to live with me, Tita. With a friend who is new in our lives, Miles. These extraordinary characters who it just never would have happened otherwise. It's this sense that circumstances, you cannot predict the outcome of circumstances, but the unexpected joys. And I suppose it was recognizing sometimes it's in simple moments. You're cooking a chicken, right? There's a moment when I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking a chicken, and I've got a baby strapped to me and a baby Bjorn. I've got the nanny, Tita, there. I've got Miles coming from her grim town miles away, which is why she's called Miles. I've got my brother, who we'd been estranged for quite some time, and I've got my brother present in the kitchen. And I stand back outside myself for a minute and think, this is extraordinary. Look who's gathered in this kitchen because of a baby.
All over a chicken.
All over a chicken.
Camilla, we're going to talk about the sort of cast of characters that you've built and who make up your family, built alongside you in a bit. But I want to just stick with the idea of this being a memoir versus a novel, because, again, that's been your experience and this is a new experience. What's achievable in a novel that you can't in a memoir, or vice versa for that matter?
I'd always been such a passionate sort of defender of the virtues of the novel, especially the virtue of immersing a reader in an experience that either could mirror their own or kind of vicariously be a completely different experience of living in the world. And I, as a reader and as a writer, I loved that journey that you could take along with a character, that sort of, that the immediacy and seeing the world through the eyes of another, and learning something about yourself, but also learning something about the world you inhabit and how people are similar and different. The difference, I suppose, in approaching memoir It's, for me, it's actually just a technical difference, which is, okay, so one is actually based in more directly based in a known reality rather than an imagined or invented reality. But those questions about fact and fiction are very blurry for me. I think the idea that we remember, memory itself is, an act of reconstruction. Memory itself chooses and picks what pieces we're going to assemble into some kind of narrative form. I think, nonfiction has this element, memoir in particular, where we're relying on our own kind of memory. It has this element of fiction in it as well, and we use a lot of the same techniques, I think, to craft a credible narrative. For me, both memoir and fiction, especially literature, is character-driven. It's not plot-driven. So you got to know that main character and trust them as the author of their own experience and walk through that experience with them.
Maybe this is the wrong word in that it has sort of a negative connotation, but memory's fallible.
Absolutely.
And so, but when you're using your memory to write memoir, because it is about your own experience, and yours especially, it's about all these people who are or were close to you. Are they challenging your narrative when this comes? Are they saying, Camilla, that didn't happen, or Camilla, you didn't get this right, or that's not how it went down?
I mean, I think that would be perfectly reasonable, right? Because we're all going to remember our experiences differently. One of the lovely things I experienced with my brother when he lived with us for a year, the first year of my daughter's life, was that he would challenge my sort of memory of things. He'd also fill them out. He had a better memory than I did for certain aspects of childhood. And we would talk, it was an occasion for us to talk a lot about our childhood. For instance, I held my baby a lot, and he said, do you think she's going to grow up spoiled? Which told me a lot about our childhood. But what I did, I was very, I was this strange kind of consciousness of what I was doing once Ian said, write it all down, write it all down. So I was recording in the moment. I often wrote down dialogue verbatim. And with Tita, for instance, she's read all that dialogue, and she thinks she's the funny one in the book, which she is. The people who've read it so far, no one's sort of disputed my version of events. My mother has felt sorry, I would say, and she has corrected me on a couple of points, which then did make it into the final draft. And that's helpful.
We're talking about these in just a minute, because she lives so largely in your life and in your book. But I want to stick with your brother, because I want to start sort of chronologically. So you grow up with your brother and your parents. What were they like? What were your folks like growing up? What was your childhood like?
Well, I feel like there are two chapters, really. There's a chapter where my father is living with us, and then there's a chapter where my father is not living with us. And those early years, at first it's marked by a journey to Canada. We come as young kids, 2 kids under 4. My parents, I imagine, quite hopeful about what Canada is going to promise and offer them. And it was interesting to see that my mother really flourished and my father didn't. He didn't understand where his place was any longer. He was very attached to these British notions of sort of class and station, and he didn't know how to be read or read this new landscape. It was kind of, I witnessed his deterioration in some ways, and there was a point at which my mother said enough, and so he left. In general, I would characterize them as quite British. It's partly cultural. There wasn't a lot of investigation of one's emotional universe, and from my father's side, there wasn't a lot of tolerance, really, for children, maybe. So I think what happens then, around the age of 9, 10, after my parents separate, my mother continues to flourish. I think she's been liberated from a weight that has come across the Atlantic with her. She continues to flourish. But, it's tricky. She's a single mom with 2 kids. She works very, very hard to make sure we don't feel we're left wanting in any kind of material fashion. But she cannot necessarily supply us with this sort of the emotional support that we might have been seeking. And I have great empathy for her in this regard, because I think she didn't come into the world with that support from her own parents. I understand where it comes from.
It's interesting because so many of the people that have been in your life are characters in so many of our lives. You talk about in your father struggling with essentially the immigrant experience. We don't talk a lot about it when it comes to people who immigrate from Britain. but he was struggling with it. He had a cultural struggle. And then you, as a young girl, watching your parents separate and the profound impact that had on you and who you've become. And your mom goes on to meet someone new.
Yes, she does.
And that's sort of the next chapter of your childhood.
Quite a few years later, when I met
Ara.
Oh yes, sorry, Ara. Yes.
Yeah. And so, what's that relationship like for you?
Well, it was fascinating because my father was quite rigid and rule-bound and, you know, British. And my mother meets a young actor. He's 28, my mom's 40. He's Armenian. He grew up in the Middle East. He grew up in Beirut. He's kind of battle-scarred in figuratively and literally. He reads Arabic newspapers. He's passionate. He's explosive. He has temper, but he's got passion. And he cooks extravagant food for us, extravagant meals. He plays music. He dances in the kitchen. He smokes pot. You know, all of it was such a contrast to the world in which I'd grown up. I describe it in the book as if somebody walked in and started letting off fireworks in the house. It was extraordinary, but my initial, I felt the assault initially of the difference, and I felt protective of my father too. So I stood back for a good long time. I stood back, kind of watching, trying to make sense of it, thinking in fact there was something wrong with it because it didn't abide by the law of my father. It took a year for me to kind of admit him into my heart, and then it was, you know, I was glommed on like a barnacle.
And then we're going to skip ahead to talk about your time as an adult. You then meet Anna. You try to start a family with Anna. Things don't work out. So what happens? Where's Camilla at this point in her life?
Oh, I'm terrified, to be honest. I'm sort of newly pregnant. I hadn't anticipated being a single parent.
Like the idea in your head is that this is going to be happy. It's all going to work out.
Not necessarily this is going to be happy, but this is going to be a family, and it's going to be a functioning family. It's going to have its happy and its sad. We're going to be real. It's going to be real. We're going to do this together. And then suddenly that narrative changes, and I have no idea what I'm embarking on. I have no idea if I have the strength. I'm devastated. I'm supposed to be experiencing joy at my pregnancy. All I can do is cry. It's complicated, and I have no idea how to create a life for us beyond this point. And it's as if I've got to start anew, kind of walking through the world with this little one who can't yet walk, and figure it out in a kind of day-to-day way. And I suppose that's why a lot of the book is quite domestic, because that is the universe you inhabit with a baby, and it's about who comes into that house, you know, and what solace we provide for each other, which is sort of beautiful and surprising too.
So this is sort of I don't want to say the turn to happy, but this is where you start assembling these people into your life. So in walks Tita, which means aunt in Tagalog.
That's right.
So tell us about Tita.
Tita arrives 10 days before I give birth, and she's going to be she's coming through the live-in caregiver program. I'm not her first employer. She's come from a previous employer who, it will turn out, she did not have a very good experience with it, and so she's a bit, you know, cautious. I make all sorts of assumptions about Tita. She's very Catholic. I make all sorts of assumptions that my situation is too complicated, kind of morally complicated for her to get her head around. I couldn't have been more wrong. The insult that I, you know, made in making those assumptions. She very quickly says, you know, I'm not an idiot. She very quickly says many things to me in a very direct ways. But one of the most profound moments was, here I am, I've just given birth. You can't know what it's going to be like, can you? It's a shock, I think, to anyone. There is this tiny thing that's completely dependent upon you. It was the second night I was alone with this baby who will not stop crying and will not manage to, I'm failing at feeding her. I'm failing in the most basic of ways. I'm terrified. I don't feel like there's anybody I can call at this point. Everybody has supported me around the birth. You know, my friends, Anna, everybody has been present, my mother, but now it's my job. I'm so scared. It's the middle of the night, and I knock really timidly on Tita's door, And she emerges, you know, her beautiful long hair, and she just looks at me and says, "It's okay, Mom, we'll be a team." She takes her duvet, puts it over her shoulder, drags it down the hall, lays it down beside our bed, and she's there for those, you know, I don't know, for the first few weeks, she was there on the floor beside me as this baby's going back and forth. And she looks at that baby and says, "What's wrong, baby?" You know, and she goes through a sort of a checklist. Are you cold? Are your clothes too tight? You know, she goes like this. And she helps me figure out how to take care of a child, and kind of, she teaches me everything. And we are a team, just as she said. And 5 years later, we are a team. She now has her own daughter. There's a whole story. And they live with us. There's a whole story here.
Her and her daughter live with you.
And her husband.
Wow.
They've been reunited.
Wow.
So it's quite an extraordinary sort of evolution. And I'm the godmother now to her baby.
This is so interesting, that this relationship between caregiver and parents, but and mothers especially, that happens all across our country, that we're building these families.
And it's this complicated mutual interdependency. And it would turn out, like Tita she began then to talk, really, in her own stories about her home, her life in the Philippines, and also her experience in Canada thus far. She began to share with me, and there were a lot of very unhappy stories about that time in Canada. And I think even then, I thought, the way in which you protect me, I'm going to protect you. There was a kind of fierceness, because we were really in the dark trench together.
Right. She's still your nanny?
She part-time, yes. Yeah.
So she's part of your family. Who else comes into this family that you're building?
Well, my brother, remarkably, we've been estranged for several years, and my mother tells him I'm pregnant, and he sends me a text, and it's full of profanity, which I won't repeat, but he basically says, "I can't believe you're pregnant. What can I do?" And I said, I was getting nesty at this stage. It was late in my pregnancy, and I said, you know, you could build me a fence. And he's like, "That I can do." But it takes him about a month to turn up, at which point I'm, you know, basically on the cusp of going into labor. But he turns up. He turns up in his big, you know, stenciled pickup truck, chain smoking. There's I shouldn't even know, parts I won't admit to. Chain smoking out the window. We're driving to the lumber yard to get the supplies to build a deck. And I sit with him for a week in my enormity, in the heat of late August, as he chain smokes and builds me a deck. Later on, in November, I asked him if he could help possibly renovate the basement. I need an office. And he embarks on this, and with the help of somebody named Miles, who I'll introduce in a minute, they renovate the basement. And then I went straight to IKEA and bought him a bed and some pajamas, and he moved in to the basement.
He came back because you were pregnant and going through a difficult time in your life.
Yeah.
And he recognized that, even though the two of you had been estranged.
Yeah. And, you know, he was going through his own difficult time. That it wasn't clear to me initially, but it became clearer. And we were able to support each other through that.
And then Miles.
Miles is a new friend I'm introduced to while I'm pregnant. And she's a PhD student working on a thesis about loneliness in a nearby town. And she's from the East Coast, and she doesn't really know that many people in this part of the world. And she comes into my life and just sort of accepts, she hasn't known me before. She accepts that I am this sort of pregnant, sad woman. There's something really generous about her spirit and her acceptance of me in that state. And she's never left my side. Like then I'm a sad new mother. and she scoops up that baby who, you know, she's not familiar with babies, and they form this their own connection. And so, you know, that scene of the roast chicken, that's who's in that kitchen. Yeah. Miles begins to sleep over because she lives on the couch, because she lives far away. She just occupies more and more space in our world, and it's beautiful, but it's fractious. It's a small house at this point, and you know, there's a lot of big personalities. I wouldn't say any one of us is a kind of a sort of a small personality.
Yeah, and it's not perfect. It's just real. It's a family, and it has that dynamic.
It does.
To like most families do, unless you're a perfect family. But anyway, okay. So what are you learning as you're writing this book, as you're writing your life and the various chapters of it? What are you learning about empathy?
I think, you know, empathy is something that I think is critical to fiction, to writing fiction, is crafting characters who are credible and believable. They don't necessarily have to be likable, but they have to be understandable, comprehensible. And for me, empathy is not about being kind. It's about being able to imagine your way into the experience of another, and that might be a complicated experience. So as I'm writing a memoir, I have to be mindful that I can't just tell a story and use the word I without exploring who I is. And that's true for everybody I know quite intimately well who's depicted in this book. I have to create them as characters. They have to become living, breathing entities on the page so that a reader will understand who they are. And it requires, in a sense, a kind of suspension of judgment in some ways. It requires, of course there are things that irritate me about them all, right? And vice versa, things about me that irritate them all. But it's not about that. It's about, can you go into their world, their experience, and render them in some kind of almost a subjective way. And we're engaged in this kind of intersubjective encounter too. The way in which I understand myself is being kind of fed by my relationships with these people, the ways in which I'm changing. And so it was about, even with my father, who's a tricky character, he's not present in the present because he's not part of my life. But even there, I want to understand what makes him the person he is. And in order to do that, I have to use empathy.
People often want to, want to approach relationships, put themselves in the other person's shoes, to have that empathy, but it's difficult for a lot of people to do. And you spoke a little bit drawing on your experience as a fiction writer about building characters. You also have a background in social anthropology. Did that help you understand and to be empathetic in your experience and also in your writing experience?
That's a good question, because I think I can't say which came first, whether social anthropology helped me as a fiction writer. What I can say is that they share a sensibility. There's a stance that you adopt, which is a sort of one of participant observer, and so you're a little bit on the periphery, and you're being sort of conscious of your own experience as you're participating in it. And that's true, I think, both as a writer and as a social anthropologist. I've often felt as a writer that if I were to participate too fully in life, I would fail to see it enough to write. And so you are kind of split. There's a dualism in both cases. I think the social anthropology probably, what interests me, the questions that interest me are not dissimilar. What makes us who we are? How do we come together in community? What kind of culture do we share? How do we transmit culture to a next generation? Those are the same sort of issues that interest me. I probably became more interested in Tita's experience as a Filipino nanny, both the culture of nannies and the politics surrounding that, and the country from which she came, which we do make a trip. We return with this baby to spend a month on her farm. To see the world that she came from. It feels like I want to both, in a personal sense, have a greater sense of balance in our relationship, but I'm also just interested culturally in what creates, and politically and economically, what creates a class of women who have to
leave their own children
often
and come
That's
to
right.
this country. Your book's called This Is Happy, and what do you want us, we the readers, to take away from Camilla's experience of searching for, presumably finding, and trying to keep happy? What are we to take away from all that?
I should probably ask you as the reader. I don't know. It's not that I had an overarching kind of agenda or message that I wanted to push through. And I feel the same way about my fiction. I'm careful because I think, if you have a message or if there's something didactic, your reader will sense it. They don't want to be told what to think or feel. I suppose it's more broad. My answer would be as broad as saying, have an experience, reflect on your own life, be in conversation in the way that I was in conversation with Ian's book, or with several of the memoirs I was reading while I was compiling that anthology.
Where are you now? What did this do for you? Because this is, I don't want to say selfish in a negative way, but writing memoir is sort of a selfish...
It's a narcissistic act.
but it's to give to yourself and give to the reader. What do you take away from all this?
I suppose the writing the writing about the experience it's not been, you know, kind of therapeutic or cathartic, but what I think it has been is it's encouraged me to have perspective on some of the, how to put it into words, is that it probably goes back to that idea of empathy. Have perspective, see that, you know, somebody is not being cruel to you. Look at where they've come from. You know, I'm thinking specifically of my father. I was thinking about how difficult it was to be a British man of a particular generation and class, and the kind of the things that he had to struggle with. It's that idea of adopting perspective rather than saying he was cruel to me. I want to understand what made him capable of cruelty.
I have to say, in reading this, I mean, it made me reflect on my own life, which I think is what ultimately you'll say you want people to do.
Yeah.
And the experience, and sometimes the mundanity of experience, but just looking at what other people bring to you and to respect that and be happy about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Pia.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.